Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming at this early hour. I'm Erwin and I'm here to report on some preliminary results of experimental work we do in Sierra Leone. Like my predecessor, I have to apologize to the discussant in the sense that all the results actually that I will show you here are different from the ones in the paper. They're based on end-line data that we collected and literally analyzed last Friday. So this is, well, feedback is very much appreciated at this point. The motivation for our project was that our long-standing partner in Sierra Leone, an NGO, was not satisfied by the way its aid project worked out. So they were giving aid to chiefs in selected villages in the hope of buying some support for the nature conservation efforts and also with the hope of improving livelihoods. Anecdotal evidence had reached them that things were not working out the way they planned, so they invited us to think about alternative forms of providing aid. And we decided to experiment, or we proposed to experiment with two forms of given aid to villagers in their region, namely unconditional aid or windfall aid to some group of villagers and an aid for work program for another group of villagers. Hoping then that the combination of these two interventions would allow us to answer two questions, namely, does aid work in this context? And if so, which type of aid would work best? And our focus on windfall aid versus work for aid hopefully would allow us to speak to three different literatures, with some imagination perhaps. So first, there is this very interesting macroeconomic literature on windfalls. In the course of this conference, we've seen sessions about the resource curse, and people have talked about the curse of aid as well. The common idea seems to be that windfall gains at the macro level accruing to the state somehow translate into institutional deterioration. So rent-seeking, corruption, the dismantling of accountability mechanisms, the reduction in democracy, etc. So at the macro level, I think there's some evidence that suggests that windfall gains are bad. Now, when we move down one level, if you like, and we look at recent development interventions, projects and programs, then I think that a rather different perspective is emerging. So some people compare unconditional versus conditional cash transfer programs. Other researchers have compared the provision of, for example, health inputs for free versus programs where recipients had to pay for these health inputs, so in an effort to recover some of the costs. The idea behind these programs were that say, free provision of inputs to recipients would lead to a lot of waste because we would be reaching the wrong people. They would not treat these inputs with proper care. They would not maintain them properly over time, etc. Or because it was provided for free, maybe there was a signal of bad quality, etc. I think it's fair to say that none of these concerns seem to be very relevant in practice. The studies that I've seen at least suggest that free provision of inputs and windfall gains to selected recipients tend to have very favorable effects. Now, if we go down one level further and we look at some of the experimental evidence with, let's say, respondents in a lab type of setting, either genuinely in a lab or in the field, then yet a third perspective emerges. So from this literature, I get two types of insights that are amenable to some testing using the data that we have, namely the perspective that property rights matter. So in a lab setting, people spend an endowment differently when they have earned it through a task than when it's given to them for free. So in a dictator setting, people treat given money differently from earned money, probably because of fairness concerns. And there is a related issue that's called mental accounting, the idea that people are spending money that is a windfall gain differently than money that they've earned. And more specifically, there is evidence that suggests that consumption of certain goods goes up if people receive a windfall gain. So disproportionately large amount of windfall gains is spent consumptively rather than invested or saved. Stepping back then, this suggests that windfall gains could lower the quality of local institutions. I mean, there is no evidence, I think, at this currently of local institutions, but that's what we would try to do. Windfall gains could potentially lower the quality of local institutions, it could erode social capital, it could invite excess consumption rather than investment, or maybe not, right? Because the empirical evidence that I just sketched is really rather mixed. So we consider this study as rather explorative, and what we try to do is examine the effect of different aid modalities, including aid as a windfall gain, on a broad range of household and village level characteristics. And unfortunately, and this is one of the main concerns that we have with this paper, is that the sample is rather small, or specifically the number of villages in which we were allowed to distribute aid is very, very limited. I'll get back to that in a minute. So this is a study on Sierra Leone. I think we don't care about this so much. This is our partner, the Gola Forest Program, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. People living close to the forest in eastern Sierra Leone, they are living with certain restrictions on how they can use the land in their vicinity. So specifically, they're not expected to go hunting, mining, or logging in the park. And in return for that, they receive these packages of aid. Let's look at this. So this is what we did. I'll be talking now about two different treatments. And there's also a control group of villages. So there's about 22 to 24 different villages receiving treatments. The first treatment is the windfall aid treatment, where we just give a certain amount of aid to all the households in selected villages. So we'll be talking about, and then we interviewed 25 to 30 households per village. So here we have 553 observations based on 22 villages. In another group of villages, we had an Aid for Work program where people essentially work to improve roads, to earn vouchers, aid vouchers. And then there's this control group, and villages were randomly allocated into one of those three bins. And these two treatments and the control group are decidedly distinct from the previous treatment, which was to give money to the chief, right? We also have some data on that, but I won't be talking about that now. So this is the nature of the intervention. Every household in the treatment villages received 6 vouchers. And because the NGO was not willing to bring cash money to these villages, but these vouchers were as good as cash, or so we like to think. Each voucher was worth 10,000 leones, or $2.50, so six vouchers in total, that's $15. Which may sound like a modest amount, and I think with hindsight maybe it wasn't a lot of money, but at the same time I think it's important to realize that this is not a trivial amount in the context of these villages, which I wouldn't say that they're cashless societies, they obviously are not, but it's very difficult for many households to get access to cash and to buy certain items. So access to cash is limited, and a windfall gain of $15 per household is certainly not nothing. In the Aid for Work treatment, we asked people to work for 6 full days on the road to earn these coupons, on the idea that 6 days of full-time work would there would be fair compensation. $15 would be fair compensation for 6 days of work. I think it's maybe been a little bit too generous. We'll get back to that perhaps. So this is a timeline of the activities. In January 2011, we did a baseline survey and explained the nature of the intervention. A month later, we came back. We invited people to participate in the Aid for Work program. Everybody did. 99% of the people were eager to jump to this opportunity. After that, we distributed the vouchers. We gave people 2 weeks to think about how to spend them. I'll get back to that in a minute. After 2 weeks, we came back. We received the orders, collected the goods, delivered them, asked people how they were going to use them, and then came back 6 months later again to collect data on the use of those vouchers and collect the data on a range of variables that speak to this windfall gain literature. And these are the data that were used in the paper that is online right now. After that, we came back to collect an additional round of data, and these are the data that I will show you now. In a next version, hopefully we will pull all these data together and work towards a fuller story. Now this is a sample, this is not a full list, but this is a sample of the goods that households could purchase with the vouchers that we gave them. So I don't want to go through this, it's just let me emphasize one thing. There are individual consumption goods on this list, so people could use the vouchers to buy spices and cooking oil and other stuff for the household that they would consume directly. There were individual investment goods, or so we like to think of them. So these include agricultural inputs, for example, and there are community goods. So these are the type of goods that people could potentially purchase with the vouchers if they would bundle their vouchers across multiple households, maybe across everybody in the village, because they were too expensive for an individual household. People could also just order cement and construction material, which they could then pull together and construct a community project. And we asked people about this. So different types of goods that they could buy with the vouchers that we give them. This is just a very quick snapshot of the type of work that people engaged in the Aid for Work program. And let me then jump to the results. So this is the first thing I'd like to show you. What we have here, so look at the left column first if you like. If 48% of the villages, all the villagers decided to bundle their vouchers to have a community project. So 48% of the villagers was just a community project and nothing else. In 43% of the villagers, everybody in the village used their vouchers to buy individual goods. And then in 10% of the villages, some people bundled their stuff together to provide a local public good, and the others and other villages in that village used their vouchers for individual purposes. And the same is true for the Aid for Work program. I'll just be comparing those two here. So the first thing to observe, I guess, is that there is a high allocation to community goods, much more than we expected. A lot of the vouchers are spent on community projects rather than individual consumption, somewhat surprising to us. At first sight, also, I think it's is interesting to observe that these data, at least, are not very consistent with the perspective that the property rights hypothesis matters a lot. So, if so, you would have expected if people work for money, they're less likely to share it with others in the community, and they're more likely to spend it on individual goods, be it consumption goods or investment goods. That's not at all what we find here, right? It seems that we find more private consumption in the windfall aid case than in the Aid for Work case. Focusing then on the subsample of villagers who used the aid that they received for private use, we can ask, how did they spend that money? Again, looking at the left column, we'll see that most of the households in the windfall aid treatment used the money for construction purposes, and they consumed only a small share of these vouchers. A bigger share seems to be consumed in the Aid for Work treatment, which, I mean, these are small numbers, obviously, but it doesn't seem to support the mental accounting hypothesis, which would propose that people who receive money for free as a windfall gain spend a larger proportion of that money for consumption purposes. It's a little bit different here. When we look at the community projects that were selected and financed through these vouchers, again, we find that consumption, I mean, even at the community level, 30% of the money was used for consumptive purposes. I'm not quite sure what that means. We'll have to go back to that. Maybe social events, maybe parties, I don't know. But there seemed to be more of that going on in the Aid for Work villages than in the windfall aid villages, which again is not so consistent with this mental accounting perspective. Now, when we go back later, so this was based on data collected at the baseline. Earlier this year, we went back to the same villages and again looked at what happened to the money. It seems like in many villages there has been a change of plan to some extent. For example, not much has changed in the windfall aid villages, but especially in the Aid for Work villages, many of the villages that intended to have a community project, they changed their mind after some time elapsed, right? So we see that the share of private consumption in those Aid for Work villages has increased quite a bit at the expense of community projects. Many of those community projects have failed, and people maybe disappointedly have taken the inputs for private consumption. With an eye on the time, let me just jump to the individual level data. So we have tried to collect data on a range of outcome variables. So these are our dependent variables. So we have grouped them as follows. Inspired by this windfall aid literature that I talked about earlier, we look at economic effects of aid. So we look at income flows, we look at assets, we look at discounting behavior, we look at effort, and we look at effort versus leisure. Some of those variables we collect through survey questions, others we collect through lab in the field type of games. So we play dictator games, we play coordination games, we play impatience games, etc. All these games to measure these things as good as we can. We have a group of variables that we call social effects. So these are maybe the effects on social capital, maybe speak to the issue of local institutional quality effect, if there are any. So this is about honesty, about sharing at the local level, measures of social capital, public good provision, coordination, and the prevalence of conflicts at the local level. And then outcome group C, those are attitudes towards the donor or the NGO, which is of course what the NGO is most important in. What is the best way for us to give aid to these villages in order to create goodwill towards forest conservation? So we asked people about their expectations with respect to future aid that they would receive. And we also did a dictator game and some other survey-based questions. So then, as you can see, for some of those indicators, we have multiple indicators, we group them. Let me just jump to the results, which is this. In terms of economic outcomes, there is very little, right? This is in a regression framework. The control villages are the omitted variable. What you see here is that across all these different categories, there is very little evidence of any significant impact of any of the aid interventions, whether it's the windfall aid or the aid for work intervention. In panel B, we compare the windfall aid versus the aid for work intervention. So we omit the control group, and here we see that there is some very, very weak evidence, and I don't want to read too much into that at all, that the aid for work intervention is consistent with lower accumulation of assets, right? Which is consistent with the idea that a larger share of these aid was spent consumptively. In the final panel, then you will see that these lower assets maybe translates into lower income flows. Let me just say that across a broad range of social indicators that we're interested in, we don't find any effect, really. It doesn't matter whether you give aid, and if you give aid, the form of aid doesn't seem to affect any of those indicators that we selected. And the same is true for attitudes towards the NGO or attitudes towards forest conservation. So this is my final slide. So this, bear in mind, the intervention was relatively modest, right? This is a $15 per household transfer, not major. The sample is modest. The number of villages in total is only 70 or something. So we should interpret all those numbers with care. But the overall, there's some perhaps overall impressions that we can glean from these data, namely that there is a lot of community spirit in those villages. There is a lot of communal projects that are funded through these interventions. At first sight, there's not much evidence for a simple property rights thesis. We don't find that individual use of aid goes up and people have to work for it. In fact, the opposite seems to be true. There's also not much evidence for mental accounting and wasteful consumption. Private consumption is not higher under windfall aid treatments. In fact, the opposite seems to be true, if there is any difference. Windfall aid does not perform worse than work for aid interventions in terms of assets accumulation and income. Yet there are very few, if any, robust results on the other outcomes. And let me just stop then by saying that in the future we intend to use the panel structure. This is all based on cross-section, and hopefully that will allow us to get some more precise estimates. But we didn't have time to do that yet. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Andrea, you are now discussant.
Okay, so very brief discussion of the paper, of the previous version of the paper, and trying to connect for what I get now from your new results. So I'm trying to summarize the first version of the paper for who of whom have not read the paper which is online. So which is, seems to be quite different, some results seem different. So the motivation is, it's quite straightforward, it's certainly interesting, so it's, there's a huge, it's very important to try to assess different ways of aid intervention, and especially the paper and the authors try to look at, how this can try to understand the consequences in terms of behavior, and reaction by recipients according to the way through which aid is disbursed. So the research question is how different way to disburse aid can affect a huge number of different social outcomes, and especially there is then just anticipate probably the things that I like the most is the great attention to try to compare conditional versus unconditional transfers, which is clearly an issue which is highly debated right now. What they do is just randomized control trials in, it seems now, a smaller set of villages, something like 70 villages in Sierra Leone, and aid is disbursed through vouchers, so it's not cash. And in the previous version, I don't know now, it seems to me that there was 4 different. So the chief is dead.
He's not dead, but he's not in this presentation, but we have those data too.
Okay, so potentially, let's say, they have, the control group, but then they have a way through which aid is disbursed through the chief, then directly to households, and this interesting aid for work program according to which people have to work for a number of days during the week. The results they found, at least to me, that was the most interesting one at that point is that conditional aid crowd out works to the personal farm, which seems to be no more true right now. But this was results, and then also there's some outcomes in terms of social preferences and community participation. So, but since there are no more there, that just try to provide a general assessment of the paper. The same thing, it's, as I said, it's interesting and nice in terms of motivation and kind of the research question, especially the part on conditional versus conditional and aid transfer. I think it's clearly my main concern reflects the fact that it's a very preliminary, especially in the way that the paper has been written and drafted so far. It's it's just mainly a presentation of results. So there is, it still lacks a lot of theoretical insights, motivation of the hypothesis behind that, especially because we are dealing with a number of social outcomes when you can come up with a number of competing theories which may explain why you find new results or you do not find some other results. So clearly there is a lot of lack of theories, and to me I think that that's a lot of stuff. When you presented the paper, and even now you have this huge set of potentially outcome variables which that are one by one very interesting, and clearly they deserve a lot of explanation and treatment and discussion. So I think I see that there is some meat for at least 2 papers. So there's a lot of stuff together, and that makes the understanding at some point difficult, because you lose track of the kind of results you have. It's not easy. It's not an easy task to try to synthesize everything and have a common story. And again, reflecting that it's very preliminary to me, which I'm not an expert in the field, is sometimes it's not very easy to understand how outcome variables are measured. As you say, sometimes are gains, sometimes are just survey answers. So it's not easy. And in terms of in constructive comments, what I think would be very interesting, maybe if you it seems to me that it's a long run involvement with the NGO there. One interesting research question to me is if you move the attention maybe on the financial side, if the way through which aid is disbursed, for instance, you could try to look at how this may affect saving decision. And so, for instance, the question which is quite straightforward is can cash conditional versus conditional aid transfer as an effect on the way through which recipients may affect their savings. And that's all.
Would you like, if you like, yes.
Thank you for these comments. I agree with essentially everything you say. Indeed, certainly the current paper, the version that you've seen, which is not really a paper but just indeed a presentation of the results, it lacks theory. But even the eventual paper that we will be working towards, hopefully before the summer, it will always remain an explorative study, right? There's so many different arguments floating around in these distinct literatures that it will always be somewhat explorative. But I agree that much more needs to be done in order to work towards a limited set of clear hypotheses that we could test using these data. I like the idea of cutting this into 2 papers. In fact, that's what we tried to do because we were, like you, concerned about this embarrassing richness of little results. So we decided to take out the chief treatment for that reason. But another way, of course, would be to to look at economic effects versus social effects in different papers and keep the treatments together. Maybe that's indeed a better way to do it. You asked about the reliability of the data, which is also, of course, a concern for us, and the precision with which we are able to estimate these variables of interest. Across the board, I think it's fair to say that we trust the game data a little bit more than the survey data, but we were unable to devise or use games to measure all the things that we considered important. So we complement those game data then with survey-based data. Your question about savings is well taken. In fact, we have collected these data. We have collected data on savings. We also have collected data on loans, informal loans. I didn't show them here in order to, because there is even more than this. I can tell you there were no impacts, again. So if this would have been very important, I would have flagged it here as a potential area for future research. Like many of the other variables that we collected, we didn't find any impact, and we could not discriminate between the impact of the aid for work versus the windfall aid treatment.
Okay, thank you. We have time for perhaps a couple of more questions. Yes, please, Oliver.
One observation is, I'm not surprised you don't find the economic effects, because although the amount is not trivial, it's probably too small to generate, especially if a lot of it is used for community projects.
Yes.
But what I'm more interested in is how do you disentangle the effect of the aid on social preferences from the effect of those social preferences on how the aid might be used? I don't see how you can separate those effects.
I agree that maybe the 15, even though cash is a real constraint in these types of societies, now with hindsight, I think that's clearly one explanation for why we find so little. The treatment is just not big enough to have any measurable impact. I guess that's part of the story. Indeed, I think the RCT design that we have chosen allows us to measure the effect of aid on these social preferences, but then indeed the effect on let's say outcomes further down the food chain, which are economic outcomes, etc., they would be confounding both the direct effect of aid as well as the indirect effect through altered preferences and attitudes, if there would have been such an effect. I think that is right. So this would be a reduced form estimate of the overall effect rather than a direct effect of let's say, lifting a binding cash constraint.
Is there any other question? Yeah, just the last one, maybe. And
the results on the aid for work on expenditures on community work are kind of puzzling, and I'm wondering if you can disentangle the effect of sharing time while doing community work from, I mean, the Aid for Work program, it asks people to work together, building a communal road or whatever. So I'm wondering if you have data from just before they started working and on what they intended to spend the money on, that would allow you to kind of disentangle that effect. And my second question is whether you have outcomes on happiness, because there's some evidence on the effects of unemployment insurance on happiness, right? And there's a bunch of arguments of what makes people happy, whether the money or working and realizing yourself through work.
We did not collect those subjective welfare measures. I agree. That could have been interesting. I think that earlier issue that you raised, I think that let's say the aid for work treatment per se, the fact that people had to work together on a road, it wasn't a local road. It wasn't one that helped them directly, because that would be another factor that would confound the economic effects, perhaps. But they had to work somewhere else, but they had to work together. And I think this treatment in itself had some effect on community spirit and did build some social capital, quite distinct from the money that we gave them later on. And I think that is also evident from the fact that in the aid for work treatment, people, a larger share of the villages decided to pool the resources and work towards a community project. I think that is exactly the explanation for this. But if that's true, then I think an implication is that these effects are not very persistent, right? Because 2 years later, this boost to the community spirit that we may have provided through the Work for Aid program has disappeared, and we see that most of those community projects that people intended to fund have failed, and they've used the money for private consumption purposes. And the aid for work programs, at that point in time, we cannot distinguish from the ones that got the windfall gain.
Okay, thank you. We now move to the third paper by Andrea Presbitero. It's going to talk about aid and vulnerability.
Okay, thanks for being here this morning. It's very early, still the third paper. And this is another paper on macro aid. With respect to the first one, I have to say that it's much less ambitious, so we don't have any good, we don't try to provide any general results in terms of providing new instruments or address causality. It's just a quite descriptive paper in terms of style-asset fact on how aid can relate to recipients' country vulnerability, and it's mainly the motivation. It just was part of a project started at UN about how aid can be integrated into an asset and liability management for recipient countries. So it just should provide a sort of generalized macro framework on which aid can correlate with the business cycle with the donors and with recipient macroeconomic conditions. So it just provides some sort of style-asset fact with any big statement in terms of causality or what is driving what. It's just some style-asset fact. So as I said, the motivation is straightforward. We all know poor countries, leaks are extremely vulnerable, and foreign aid can be an instrument that can mitigate adverse effects of macroeconomic fluctuation. And the idea was, and I think that project stopped, but the idea was, to see how, under which condition may aid be a part of sovereign asset liability management by poor countries. And clearly, to do that, aid had to be a reliable source of funding, had to be a stable source of funding, and also a predictable source of finance. And so for that to be true, we need to address and to look at the number of issues. 3 issues that the paper tried to tackle is, how aid is dependent on external condition, and maybe we look at donors being a cycle, and just because that clearly limit the recipient control over aid. And the second one is how foreign aid can be considered a sort of hedging resource. So we're going to look at how aid is correlated with other capital flows coming into recipient countries. And the third issue is aid unpredictability. So we deal with a number of issues which are as been dealt by the current literature, but we try to put the evidence all together and provide some new results. Again, in terms of motivation, that's vulnerability. That's a vulnerability index developed by some people at the IMF, and you see that vulnerability index declined over time in low-income countries from the 90s, even if you clearly, it's pretty obvious because of the global financial crisis, vulnerability is rising again in those countries, and so again, it's a problem that we kept in mind. And the second issue is about the flow of ODA. Clearly, I think that everybody in the audience more or less is aware of the kind of figures and numbers aid to developing countries increased. 2 points here are worth seeing. The first one is the black line, which is the coefficient of variation of aid, which say that volatility of aid has been more or less pretty stable over a whole period. It is not particularly high. What is more challenging and more disturbing is unpredictability of aid, which is the difference between commitment and disbursement, which it's some period of time is significantly high, and especially in the last year. So unpredictability is something which is it's an issue again that should deserve some consideration. So. Again, in terms of the background, still generally poor countries deal with shocks through bilateral and multilateral assistance and with government debt, and clearly the other thing, the other side of the macro management is the management of reserves, which increased substantially over the last 10 years, more or less, because mainly driven by precautionary purposes. And the other flow, which is important again in the last 10 years, is remittances, which is generally proved to be a good. They respond positively in terms of when a country is affected by disasters or output volatility. And as I said, there's a huge literature on aid procyclicality and volatility and aid unpredictability. Some of the literature provide consistent results. Some other, especially in aid procyclicality, is much less clear. So moving to some data here. The first thing is I want to see how aid disbursement relate to economic condition by donors, and here I just plot for six main donors: ODA net disbursement and output gap, and I want to see just to see very straightforward pattern in the data. And the red lines identify periods of banking crisis, because again you can see that those here are years of when GDP is severely affected, and so you may expect aid budget to be cut significantly in those years. And again, if you look at the countries, you see, in some cases there is some sort of strong correlation between the business cycle and aid disbursement. In some other case, not. And even with the bank, just if you look at the banking crisis instead, you find that there is an effect on aid, but in some countries yes, in some other less. So it's not so obvious. So what we do is we estimate a very simple model when we try to explain aid outflows from donor countries in terms of aid over population. We have a sample of 22 main OECD donor countries for something like 25 years. And it's a very simple model when we explain aid over population, lag values, trend of the GDP trend, output gap, and the standard bench of standard set of controls. Simple estimate plus fixed effect. We just deal with autocorrelation in the other term, no more than that. And these are the results. Clearly, what we find is clearly there is a positive association between the output gap and aid outflows. And also, the coefficient of banking crisis is negative and significant. So, on average, you find that when macroeconomic conditions in advanced economies are going worsening, the aid budget is shrinking, which is pretty obvious, but still we tried then to magnify, to try to have an idea of the economic impact, and it's significant in the sense that back on the calculation, if you put everything together, in the banking crisis here, disbursement in terms of population in per capita terms are something like $12 less than in non-crisis years, and it's given that on average the disbursement is $190, which means there is a decline in 6%, which is quite relevant. And if you put together something like a scenario in which you have a 3 percentage point contraction of GDP below trend, so you have a severe recession like the crisis right now, and a banking crisis on top of that, then you find that the effect is 7.1% reduction in the disbursement of aid, which is significant. Second thing, we look at how aid, we look at the recipient side, so we want to see how aid inflows are correlated to economic shocks and other capital inflows in the recipient countries. So in this case, we have a panel of developing countries, 62 developing countries for, again, 35 years, starting in 1975, and we explain aid to GDP inflows as a function of the other capital inflows, so basically remittances, FDI, and total debt service. We don't have information on other residual capital flows, which are, not in terms of volumes, are quite irrelevant, like, portfolio flows. And then we have the macroeconomic condition, because we want to see if aid is responsive, to the macro condition in the recipient country. So we have growth, terms of trade shock as a measure of output shocks. And again, results are pretty straightforward. The first thing is clearly aid is persistent, because the lag term is 0.6 or more, and then we find that clearly aid is correlated with the other capital flows in terms that it helps smoothing other capital flows. So for instance, when total debt service increases, so countries maybe are highly indebted, then aid inflows are higher. So it may be evidence of sorts of defensive lending, for instance, also by donors. When FDI goes down and aid increases, so there is a negative correlation between the private sector flows and official grants. And there is also an effect in terms of output shocks, because when you have terms of trade shocks, then decline in terms of trade, aid increases. The coefficient is small, but if you look at the elasticity, the effect is quite significant. Okay, that's what I've already said. And last thing, we look at aid unpredictability. So before moving to different exercise, we just take the results. We just take this model here. We take the food specification. We try to control for what we think it's more relevant, and then we look at how well this model can explain. We calculate in sample predicted values of aid inflows on those countries, and then we compare prediction with actual values. And this year, actual values are on the y-axis, the predicted values are on the x-axis, and clearly, if aid is predictable, you should find, the point staying on the 45 degrees line, and here you find that there is some variation, and variation in some cases are also consistent, because they go from 0 to 17%, which is significant. But then we move to a model in which we look at the aid unpredictability in a different way, and we rely on a number of existing studies, and we measure unpredictability just as a deviation of committed aid from actual disbursements scaled by GDP, and we try to explain aid and unpredictability. And again, we have a number of control variables related to the size of the country, to the income level, and the output growth mainly, and the lag. And here again, the results. What we find is that the question is there any kind of country-specific factor which is significant and systematically correlated with any unpredictability? So which are the countries which are more exposed and more vulnerable to aid unpredictability? And we find first that aid unpredictability is actually a shock. Because if you look at the lagged values, the coefficient is small and never significantly different from 0. So which means that the unpredictability comes really as a shock to the countries, and there is a positive coefficient on GDP per capita, which means that at least it's not the poorer countries in the sample which are the more exposed to unpredictability of aid, while it seems to be the larger and the richer countries, and also the countries receiving more aid, because commitment over GDP is just the amount of aid the countries received, and we found that there is a strong positive association, because larger countries who receive more aid are the one, and richer countries on average are the one receiving more aid. And then We control for a number of other variables and, related, for instance, to policy, to the macro environment, to financial development, and we don't find any systematic relation apart from the terms of trade shock, in which we find that, some sort of, when you have terms of, again, it's good in the sense that when there's a terms of trade shock, then you find that unpredictability is lower. So the two sorts of problems, two sorts of vulnerability, they don't amount one on top of the other. And then another interesting result is that we find that aid unpredictability increase over time. So here is the picture. We just estimate the model without time dummies, and then we calculate the predicted values year by year, and we calculate the predicted values and average by year the results, and here is our measure of how aid unpredictability changes over time. And the results is interesting because what you find is clearly, if you look at the last period, the last 10 years, you find an increase in aid unpredictability, which is consistent with the descriptive picture I've shown you before. So just to make the point that this is clearly a source of concern that donors and multilateral in some way have to try to deal with. So to summarize, the motivation was try to think about how aid can be a part of the sovereign asset liability management in a way to think about, to have a framework through which aid can be used and manage it to mitigate risk. And so we want to, for that it's critical that aid should be reliable and aid flow should be reliable and expected. And we find that clearly aid is relatively stable, so there is a huge evidence that it's strongly path dependence, and also there is amount of evidence that it's negative, it's correlated with other private capital flows in the sense that it's smooth variation in private sector capital flows. And also generally you find evidence that the aid is higher in years and countries when there are adverse economic shock. So that's the positive side of the story, if you want. It's all this correlation which goes into the idea that aid can actually be a source of shock absorber for low-income economies. Then anyway, we want to spot at least two sources of concerns according to which donors and multilaterals should try to take into account. First is clearly the recipient does not have any full control over aid inflows, since aid clearly responds a lot to economic shock in donor countries. So that's clearly the point low income community clearly make, that donors should try to have a stable source of funding. And in the paper, there is some sort of discussion about through which how donors and multilaterals should try to find ways to stabilize aid outflows without relying too much on how their economy is going year after year. And the other one is that aid is not always predictable, and we've seen that especially in the last years, disbursement fall short from expectation, which is clearly related to the fact that aid is correlated to economic condition in donor countries. So there are some policy discussion in the paper, and especially related to how aid can be managed by donors and the recipient. In terms of if you look at the recipient side of the problem, this idea of having aid into asset liability management is led to the fact that aid could be managed together with reserves. So even the idea is that aid and reserves should be managed together in sort of stabilization tool, and which goes to the idea of how aid is absorbed or not in the first paper. So for instance, the idea would be that when there are aid surges, aid can be not absorbed, just accumulated through reserves, and this part of reserves can be used in periods when aid will fall short of expectation, which we see is something that happens. So the idea was to put together reserve and aid in a sort of same tool to stabilize and mitigate economic fluctuation. And I think that's all. Thanks.
Okay. Sorry, I can't see very well. What is? Should be. Okay, the name was a bit changed. Okay, that's fine. I was. Okay, thanks a lot. No, this is not. Sorry, this. No. Sorry, this is fine. Okay, sorry. Okay, I'm the discussant of this paper, as you might see. So basically, okay, I think it's very clear what the paper does. So basically, this paper is looking at the empirical evidence regarding the potential role of aid as a shock absorber and about aid predictability. So what Andrea finds is that aid shrinks in response to economic shocks in donor countries, even though the effect is not strong in magnitude, contributing to aid volatility in turn. Then that aid disbursements are overall stable and shock absorber, which is good news. And finally, however, aid is not found to be quite predictable. And the indicator in this case was the distance between aid commitment and the disbursement. So what I like in this paper, I like this approach of combining these three complementary aspects, so of looking at them all together, and looks new to me. So if it is true, perhaps it should better emphasize as a contribution to the literature. And also I like it because it's relevant for policy implication. More general, I've got some more general comments and more specific ones. Regarding the more general comments, of course, it's true that in principle aid should be stable and potentially independent from donors' business cycle. Even though I see in this paper a potential trade-off between aid stability, which is of course important, but also aid selectivity. Because in the end, aid should also not become independent with respect to recipients, let's say, merit. And for example, I see the risk of what we call in a paper of ours, defensive granting, so the idea of use grants to accommodate the reduction in net loans, avoiding thus a correction of debtor countries' trade deficits as their debt increases. So the idea is that grants becomes in turn a substitute, to the extent that grants becomes a substitute for loans, if we look at this equation over here, we can see that if actually loans do react contracting with respect to debt, anyway, an alternative to compensate with this reduction could be by increasing grants, so avoiding, in this case, a correction in the trade deficit, which is measured by X. Finally, perhaps you should try to indicate more clearly what is the theory that lies behind the specification you choose in the equations. And finally, maybe you should include some more control variable, let's say. So I suggest, for example, to consider the influence on some political aspects in all three equation, because there is evidence that political and strategic aspects are not important only for recipients, for donors, but also not only for recipients, but also for donors, as in the paper you quote by Fuchs and Rere. And also regarding aid predictability, these type of variables could be important because there is some, for example, anecdotal evidence concerning the disbursement associated to a country being a temporary member of the UNCH, which suggests that aid disbursement might vary with response to the voting pattern within the UNCH assembly. Also, you might try to consider some more indicators of institutional policy type of variables. I suggest CPIA, but you might think of something else. Also, you might want to see to control with some other indicators of the shocks, like currency crisis, besides banking crisis and debt crisis. And I wonder if you try to add the regressors. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, would you like to collect some more variants? Okay, is there any more questions in the floor? Please, Oliver.
Just one observation, that the difference between commitments and disbursements can change either because of something that donors do, and it could be exuberant pledges, which they never intend to meet, or other effects, but also it could vary because of something that happens in the recipient.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to disentangle those with what you're doing.
Any more questions?
Okay.
Okay, so you want...
Yeah, okay, thanks for the comments. Yeah, starting from the last observation here, clearly that's perfectly true, and you know, in my setup, there's no way to. I do not address the point, and you know, it's a tricky point in the sense that you know it's tricky paper in the sense that you know you should do that, and you know, but then the way the paper started, was not ambitious, and then if you start doing kind of stuff, then you have to write full paper, and you know, I don't know if given commitment, you know, since we're talking of commitment, given commitment is something that's doable, but clearly that's an interesting, and that applies to a lot of other comments that Silvia has done, which was generally a lot sensible, and especially, you know, if you want to, especially to explain unpredictability, and they may be going into that direction, and you know, how, you know, if you want, you have to take into account, you know, the policy framework, and you know how the macro management framework in countries changes over time, and you know all these political variables on the recipient and donor side are clearly important. But again, for now, the idea was just to take everything very simple and provide some stellar fact. No, clearly legged regressor, you know, that's the one I did. You know, even crisis, the idea was, again, just want to look at the banking crisis, just because when you started the project, that was the question. Probably now the question is sovereign debt crisis, so you just change it. But it replies to a specific question. And and again, the other good point is the one about, you know, stability versus selectivity, which again, in some way, you should try to control, adding this policy and macro policy variable, expecting that maybe donors are actually reacting to that. So that's clearly potentially a lot of things to do, and you know, we'll see if there is time. Thanks.
Okay, so if there is no more question, I think we can go to
Move to yourself.
Yeah, move to yourself. So can you please?
Yes. Right.
The referee. You're the referee.
And if you can help me to see. So should be that one? No, this is this one maybe. Yeah. Yes. Thanks. Thanks. Excellent. Okay. Thanks a lot. Okay, so this is joint work with Axel Dreher from the University of Heidelberg, and what we actually are interested in this paper is basically trying to provide a sort of formal model for regarding aid ownership. In particular, in order to do that, we focus on the importance of communication between donor and recipient. So the idea that, of course, bottom-up reforms are preferable than top-down changes is a well-established fact, and also the idea that successful reform design should require effective transmission of information, so communication between donors and recipients. However, less is known on the specific mechanism under which such information should be transferred by recipients to donors and vice versa. The idea is that donors and recipients, each one of those own specific information. So there is asymmetry information which is assumed to be two-sided. And however, due to some misalignment of interest between the two, they don't have incentive to fully reveal what they know to each other because they have incentive to use communication transmission in a strategic way. So to reveal enough in order for communication to take place, but not enough in order to influence some way the action of the other agent. So what we do is identify, as I said, the transmission of information between donors and recipients under misaligned interests as an additional, of course, mechanism which can help to understand the optimal allocation of control rights over reforms. So the approach is taking a principal agent model where information is transmitted between donors and recipients, and whereas mutual communication is important because, as I said, both have private information regarding the first best adjustment program, which regards analytical and cross-country knowledge for the donor and versus local knowledge for the recipient. Information is soft, meaning that it's unverifiable, or if so, is verifiable only at high cost. And the misalignment of interest between the two can be depend on various channels. For example, externalities, politics, lobbying. We are not actually interested in modeling which one works better. We simply take them for granted. So, as I said, the quality of the reports, so the quality of the information which is transmitted between the two, crucially depends on the conflict of interest which which sender and the recipients face. So this framework basically allows us to use a cheap talk game in which we compare two incentive schemes, delegation versus centralization, relative to the quality of the transmitted information. Under delegation, the borrowing country will be left with considerable freedom to devise its own details of action, which in the empirical exercise we proxy with the budget support scheme, while under centralization, control rights over policies are allocated to the donor, which in our empirical exercise we proxy with the project aid. So, main results is that the optimal allocation of control rights over policies depends on the relative importance of the two parties' information, as well, of course, on the size of the agency bias, which simultaneously affect the information transmitted and implemented reforms in turn. And then, as the empirical analysis that we carry out confirm that the importance of donors' private information influences the amount of project aid, so of centralization, while the recipient's local knowledge is positively correlated with the amount of budget support schemes, with which we take as a proxy of delegation. So, very briefly, not much time to discuss the related work, but of course this paper is related to at least two streams of literature. So, one of strategic information transmission, which is built in an industrial organization type of framework where the conflict of interest relates those of the owner of the firm and, for example, a manager, and also the literature of foreign aid. So what is new is that this is the first time that communication is explicitly introduced in the context of foreign aid, and also is the first time that we look at the choice between different aid schemes in responsive to communication issues between donors and recipients. So very briefly, let's see the details. A sketch of the theory. So we have two agents, a donor and the recipients. Both should take a decision about the policy vector P, where the first best policy vector P star is determined by two stochastic factors G tilde and D tilde, which represents the private information of the donor and the recipients, and which are distributed uniformly over these two intervals, OG, O capital G, and O capital D. The first best P star policy scheme is the results of the use of the full information of the donor and the recipients. As I said, this reflects the fact that mutual communication between the two is important. The utility of the donor is decreasing in the distance between the policy vector, which is actually chosen, P, and the first best policy vector for the donor's point of view. Because, as I said, as there is a bias, as there is misalignment of interest between the two, the first best optimal policy for the donor point of view will be basically equal to the first best policy vector plus something, because the donor is assumed to be benevolent, of course, but still, due to its role, for example, if you think about multilateral donors, they might want to take into account about externalities of these policy vectors, so of the policy which are chosen, so they might want to prefer the country to do a different vector with respect to the first one. Similarly, this kind of reasoning works for the recipients, which has a policy vector which has a first best policy vector, so the one which is preferred by the government, which is equal to the first best one minus something. In this case, we take into account about the idea that the recipient governments might in turn be influenced by the pressure of some interest groups, which for some reason might oppose reforms. So in the end, the distance between the two, capital B, reflect the extent of the agency problems between the government and the recipients. We have 3 stages. In the first stage, the donor should decide whether or not to delegate authority over control rights. Then in the second stage, that each of the two learns their private information, and if authority has been delegated, then communication is between the donor to the recipients, then the government will ask the technical advice, and then it will choose the policy. On the other case, if authority has not been delegated, so under centralization, then communication is goes in the other way around, so between the recipients to the donor, and in this case, it's going to be the donor asking for some advice in order to design the policy reforms to the recipient. Then in the third stage, the policy is implemented and the game ends. So what the idea of the cheap-dog game, very briefly, is that the existence of a bias creates some endogenous signaling cost for the government if we are now describing communication under delegation, meaning that communication, as I said, goes from the donors to the recipients. So the idea is that the recipients will only learn the interval, the true realization of D belongs to. So this is the idea of a cheap talk, in which basically the message is not going to reveal the true value of the private information of the donor in this case, but it's going to tell you only the interval in which the true realization belongs to. So this is a partition equilibria. However, Crawford and Sobel shows that there is always an informative equilibrium in which the number of intervals n is maximal, because of course the higher the number of those partitions, the more informative the message will be. And both the donor and the recipients, both agents, will coordinate on these most communicative, most informative equilibrium, and in then which allows us to consider a focal equilibrium, so a unique equilibrium in which basically the expected loss, ex-ante expected loss of the donor is continuous and increasing in D, because D is what you lose under delegation, what you partially lose under delegation. Of course, in the other case of centralization, where communication is going to be between the recipients to the donor, then in this case, what you lose, of course, partially under centralization is the private information of the country. And so the donor's ex-ante expected loss is going to depend on G. So this basically allows us to find, this represents the equilibrium in this way, graphically in this way, in which here we have the private information of the recipient, the private information of the donor, and these are the area representing centralization and delegation with respect to the relative importance of these two private information. So the idea is that this delegation area is going to be smaller than the centralization area due to the existence of a bias. So due to the existence of a bias of a distance between the two, not only the private information of the recipient should be greater than the private information of D, but should also be greater than a threshold value. Okay, I can skip that. So let's see what the data basically says. So we take data on general budget support and project aid. As I said, these two schemes are meant to proxy for our delegation and centralization scheme in the theory. And since many countries receive no aid at all, while others receive aid in only one of the two types, basically we try to avoid both problems by treating the two types of aid in separate regressions, rather than using, for example, the ratio of the two. Okay, so very briefly, I have to present how we try to proxy for the relative importance of both the bias and the private information of both agents, because these are going to be, of course, our variables of interest. So to proxy for, so let's think about the bias. So to proxy about the bias, we, as I said, if you remember the utility function, we see that the distance between the two might be influenced between the existence of some externalities associated to the policies in one country, which may impose externalities on others. So to the extent that the donors care about externalities, then we proxy the possible existence of the bias depending on these, considering indicators of, for example, openness of trade openness and globalization of the country, because the idea is that the bigger the country, the more open the country, the more likely is going to be to impose spillovers effect on others. As measure of bias, we take measure of institutional capacity and socioeconomic complexity, because according to the literature on political economy, basically this should account for a status quo bias, which is increasing in the measure, in how complex, how divided the country is. To measure this, we take ICRG indicators such as government stability, the quality of the bureaucracy, and measure of ethnic tensions. Regarding the information, of course, there is some overlap with the bias regarding the variable that we choose. So if we think about the private information of the donor's informational advantage is going to be more relevant for both more open countries, and also the quality of the government staff could also be a reason for a recipient to seek a donor's technical advice, which are going to measure by considering the bureaucracy quality in the recipient country. Regarding the private information of the government, the importance of a recipient's local knowledge is going to be more important for less transparent country, of course. So for countries in which data are less easily available, so to proxy for that, we take a transparency indicator, so the share of the series for which data are available out of the about more than 1,000 series in the World Bank won the World Development Indicators. We take the number of telephone lines and index of press freedom. Also, local knowledge is going to be more important for countries with a more complex socioeconomic structure. Okay, regarding the control, we take standard determinants of aid allocation, so indicator of merit, need, and political variables. As I said, we estimate two separate equations regarding project aid and budget support. We use a Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood estimator, which is shown to be outperforming OLS and TOBIT with regression with many zero observation in the data, especially when the zero is not a result of some censoring mechanism, as in our case. So let's see briefly what we find. Okay, in the first two columns, we wholly included, let's say, standard control variable determining aid, and we see that basically the only variable which is positively associated with both project aid and budget aid is CPI indicators, so indicators of policy. So I should have said that with this type of estimation, the coefficient are incident rate ratio, so meaning that they are going to represent the relative importance, the relative effect on the dependent variable for one unit change of the explanatory variable. So if this coefficient basically is greater than 1, it means that there is an increase in the dependent variable, while if it is smaller than 1, this is associated to a decrease in the dependent variable. So, for example, if we look at transparency, our measure of the importance of the relative importance of the local knowledge, for instance, we see that an increase in transparency in an increase in transparency is positively associated to an increase, quite a high increase in project aid, which is consistent with the theoretical results, in the sense that the more transparent a country is, the less important its private information, the private knowledge is going to be. So the more likely for a centralization scheme to be chosen. At the same time, the quality of bureaucracy quality instead is negatively correlated to the choice of a project aid, because the higher the quality of the bureaucracy, let's say the less important the centralization scheme will be for the recipient country, in the sense that it doesn't need the donor knowledge in order for, policy reforms to be devised. Finally, regarding budget, okay, zero. So the last thing I want to say regards the importance of, let's say, a measure of socioeconomic complexity in the recipient country. So in this case, we see that ethnic tension, so we should, higher ethnic tension is going to be less ethnic tension. So a decrease in the bias is going to positively affect the choice of a budget support. And in this case, actually, this effect here is the results of two effects, as you might remember, the existence of the bias and the existence of the importance of the local knowledge. So for this reason, we need to disentangle these two effects, interacting this measure with the measure of transparency. And in this case, what we see basically is a positive, the value is a positive value of the interaction between the two, reflecting the fact that only when transparency is high, so only when the private information of the recipients is less likely, basically a decrease in the bias is going to increase the amount of budget support. And the effect is the opposite one for the budget. So I think I have to basically conclude here. So what we basically find is that optimal allocation of control rights depends on the relative importance of the two parties' information and on the size of the bias in the theory, and also the empirical results provide some support, in particular to this idea regarding the importance of donor and recipients' information. Thank you. Sorry.
Right, okay, so I was interested in this paper. I enjoyed reading it. I think one of the interesting things it does is is what you mentioned right at the end, that it kind of endogenizes the control rights, the decision whether to go for budget support or to go for project aid. And that seemed quite an interesting thing to do. And then to link that to the kind of cheap talk literature on communication seemed an interesting thing to do as well, and I've not seen that done before. So I suppose if I have a reservation about the theory, it's that the kind of conclusions it leads to are sort of almost what you'd expect, before you saw the theory. And I wondered whether one way to sort of enrich the story would be to consider what happens if there are multiple recipients. So, I don't know whether there's a literature on that in the communication literature, the cheap talk games, but in a sense it could be interesting to think about a donor facing several recipients and then how that changes the communication behaviour of the individual recipients when each of them knows that there are other recipients who could alternatively receive the money. And so I thought that might be one way to enrich the story. So on the empirical work, I think you could see some of the results as consistent with the story, but the trouble is it's obviously difficult to measure the kind of concepts in the theory, and so it's not really a test of the model, it's more sort of saying here are some results which are consistent with this model. The problem is that, if you think about explaining project aid versus budget support, you'd probably have kind of governance indicators in there and other sort of similar related indicators quite independently of a sort of story about communication. So I sort of see the empirical work as potentially consistent with the story, but it could be consistent with others. and it's not really a test, but I can see that a test would be very difficult to implement, given that it's not obvious how to measure the concepts. So I think my most important comment, though, is whether you could enrich the story by considering a game with multiple recipients.
Focusing on the theory, you mean?
Yeah, I wondered if that would lead to kind of a richer set of conclusions.
But
So,
you mean a donor who is facing several recipients at the same time? He has
Yeah.
to choose.
yeah.
I mean, in what sense?
So you've got a
you think
two-player.
No, I see the scheme,
Yeah.
but in what do you think is going to be the main contribution theoretically of considering multiple senders, let's say?
Yeah, so I don't know sort of how much that's been done in the literature and whether it's, I don't even know whether it's tractable. But it just seems to me that if you think about the problem facing the recipients, they're communicating a message to the donors, but potentially the way they do that is going to be influenced by their knowledge that other recipients are also communicating a message to the donors. And so that just seemed to me that would be quite an interesting thing to explore, if it's tractable. Which it may not be.
I think it's tractable, and it has been done, for example, in the literature on fiscal federalism, where the idea that the central then is, of course, a central authority of fiscal expenditure, who is going to choose on how to finance local project, I mean, in the specific regions, and in this case, of course, there are multiple senders in the sense of the multiple districts, and the fact that they are might send more, I don't know, conflicting information might in turn explain, for example, some inefficiency in the local provision of public goods regarding uniformity of over provision. But the point is, in that case, there are there are of course a lot of connections regarding regions in the sense that they belong to the same nation. So in this case, I don't know how important are the interaction across different recipients in order to be so crucial for the behavior of the donor. This is what I'm saying. Anyway, it's a good suggestion, and I can think, of course, about it. Regarding the institutional, of course, yes, we are aware about this difficulty in measuring this bias and the importance of bias and local knowledge. And so one way we try to be more convincing is that of building interaction between information, proxy for information and proxy for for bias, because maybe the interaction, is more convincing to the extent that the effect varies for different level of transparency. But you are totally right. We cannot at all claim that we are actually testing the theory, rather than findings, of course, evidence which is consistent with what we find. Yeah, this is actually true. Sorry, maybe I interrupted.
No, that's right. It's fine, don't worry.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please, otherwise I will be discriminated.
My concern is that I think, it's in the theory and it's in the empirics, is I think there's a mismatch between your right-hand side and your left-hand side, or what you're trying to explain and the way you're trying to explain it. Because maybe if the issue you're interested in is the donor's choice between budget support and project aid, then policy reform in a general sense is not the relevant factor. That's not what donors are concerned about when they're making the choice of which instrument to use. They're more concerned about how the aid is being allocated in expenditure. And Axel should know, because he published our paper in his journal, that the measures of the allocation of spending do a very good job of predicting budget support. So, that's what the donors are thinking about. They're thinking, which of these instruments will we use to ensure that the aid is spent in the right way? Whereas if you're talking about the policy reform, you're really going back to the conditionality type literature. And I think the information can come in there, but a lot of that literature would suggest that what really counts is the priors. You know, what does the donor believe about these recipients? And there's some work that partly has many recipients there, and it will be, you know, the donor will make their choice depending on their beliefs about the behavior of these recipients. And then the more information they get about that behavior, that will improve their priors. And that may improve their
The
decision.
prior, sorry, about what? About
Prior will
what?
be the belief about the type of recipient they're dealing with. You know, is it a good recipient who will implement the reforms? Is it a bad recipient? Or is it some intermediate type of recipient who, if you encourage them, they'll do the right things? But I think that with that issue, you're into conditionality rather than the choice of budget support. So I feel there's a mismatch.
So you think that the choice between budget support and project aid is rather determined by what? Sorry.
The donor's choice of whether or not to give general budget support is largely, is very well explained by, both theoretically and empirically, by indicators of how the recipient is allocating government spending. So if the donor, you know, wants the aid to be spent on a mixture of health and education and kind of poverty reduction, if the recipient is spending their aid in that way, then they're far more likely to get general budget support. Whereas if they're not, and if the donor is worried about delegating to a recipient that doesn't have good control over how it allocates spending, then the donor will want to retain control and they'll give project aid. And in practice, of course, the donors give a bit of both to each country.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I see your point. So, but in your idea, there is no room at all for real delegation, in fact, because, and also between, I mean, and also there is no room for the importance of information. So, because the idea is that delegation is going to be more important when local information is more relevant. And this is not necessarily a function of what the country is already doing and how is already spending is, I mean, he has already decided about its aid allocation, but is related to some sort of, I don't know, some sort of more general context regarding the fact that the donor is going to make a better use of this money if, to some extent, is left with some degree of freedom in choosing how to do. So it's a sort of decision which basically, I mean, it's a change with respect to the status quo in a sense. So in order to enhance a better use of information where is of course is relevant and important and not be used up to a certain point, then the idea is to change the type of instruments to encourage more use of information that otherwise would be.
But one way of interpreting the point I'm making is that there are observables that give the donors information about the behavior of recipients that is relevant to the choice to give budget support. So there are observables that the donors can use.
Yeah.
There will also be negotiations and discussions.
Yes,
so
perhaps.
None of the donors give all of the aid as budget support.
No, yes, sure. I see what you mean, but here the asymmetry of information is not, that doesn't concern the fact that the recipient is a good one, is a good type or a bad type, so it's going to make a good use or a bad use of what he receives. The idea is that basically the recipient is not going to make the effort in using, it doesn't have the incentive to using its own information when it doesn't have enough room for action. This is the point. So it's not. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Is not something. It's something which is dynamic in a sense. So, if the recipient is left with some freedom in deciding these policy reforms, then it might make a better use of these type of these resources. And in that sense, a change of instruments might help and might enhance this greater ownership. This is basically what we are trying to to model. Otherwise, if in a different type of scheme, then if the recipient is not give incentive, is not give freedom to act, then it might not want to use the information, and in which it ultimately results in a relatively poor use of this money. This is basically, so this is the type of asymmetry of information which concerns the two. And also actually in a two-sided private information, it's not so easy to model multiple interaction, because then it's going to be, it's not only the private information of the recipients which is important, but also the private information of the donor, because they need to mutually communicate. So,
yeah, I can see it might be too difficult to do. The other thing I wondered about was whether, if you sort of thought about a donor allocating to NGOs. So if you thought about local knowledge, then Easterly or Hayek or someone might say, well, actually, the government doesn't have local knowledge either, and sort of you actually want to delegate money to NGOs, and then the NGOs are trying to send signals. That might be one way to think about it. That and then there would be something. That's right. And then there would be something in common across the NGOs that they're trying to communicate. And then how does that play out as a communication game? Could be interesting.
yeah. Okay, thanks. Okay, maybe it's too late anyway. Yeah, so thank you very much. I will close the session here, and let's go to the coffee break.